What they discovered beneath the rotting floorboards of slave cabins across the American South wasn't treasure. It wasn't gold or silver or forgotten heirlooms. What archaeologists found, hidden in the darkness beneath those cramped quarters where human beings were forced to live like cattle, was something far more valuable. Something that would shatter everything we thought we knew about survival, resistance, and the unbreakable human spirit. In cavity after cavity, beneath plantation after plantation, from Virginia to Louisiana, they found the same thing. And when they finally understood what they were looking at, hardened scientists wept. This is the story of those discoveries, and of one woman whose buried secrets would speak across 2 centuries to reveal a truth more powerful than any history book ever written. Dr. Sarah Chen had been an archaeologist for 17 years, but she'd never felt her hands shake like this. Not when she'd excavated Viking burial sites in Norway, not when she'd uncovered Mayan temples in Guatemala. But here, kneeling in the red clay dirt of what had once been slave quarters on the Riverside Plantation in South Carolina, her fingers trembled as they brushed away centuries of soil. It was March 2019, and Sarah's team had been granted permission to conduct archaeological surveys on 12 former plantation sites across the South. The goal was simple on paper: document the material culture of enslaved people, find artifacts that could tell their stories, in ways that plantation owners' records never would. But nothing about this work was simple. Every artifact they uncovered represented a human life that had been systematically erased from history. "Dr. Chen, you need to see this," called out Marcus Williams, one of her graduate students. He was 20 feet away, working in what their ground-penetrating radar had identified as Cabin 7. His voice had that particular quality. Not excitement exactly, but something more solemn. Something that made everyone on the dig stop what they were doing. Sarah rose from her knees, her joints protesting. She was 43 but felt 70 after a week of crawling through the ruins of human suffering. She walked over to where Marcus knelt, his dark hands covered in red clay that looked too much like dried blood. "What is it?" she asked. Marcus didn't answer with words. He simply pointed down into the shallow cavity he'd uncovered beneath what would have been the cabin's wooden floor. The floor itself had rotted away decades ago, leaving only the stone foundation and the packed earth where people had slept, eaten, loved, and died. Sarah knelt beside him and looked down. Her breath caught. There, carefully arranged in the hollow space, was a collection of objects that made her heart break and soar simultaneously. Buttons. Dozens of them, maybe 50 or 60, each one different. Some were brass, tarnished green with age. Others were bone or wood or ceramic. There were plain ones and fancy ones, military buttons with eagles on them, delicate pearl buttons that might have come from a lady's finest dress. But it wasn't just buttons. Nested among them were other small treasures: a tiny doll made from corn husks, its face long since faded but its form still intact, 3 marbles made of clay, a bird carved from a piece of bone, so detailed you could see individual feathers, a handful of glass beads in deep blue and red, a small iron key, and there, at the center of it all, a tarnished silver thimble with initials engraved on it: E.M. "There's something else," Marcus said quietly. He reached down with the delicate brush they used for the most fragile artifacts and gently cleared away a bit more soil. Beneath the thimble was a piece of folded fabric, miraculously preserved in the dry cavity. With excruciating care, Marcus lifted it out. Sarah's hands did shake now as she took the fabric from him. It was coarse homespun cotton, the kind enslaved people were given to make their own clothes. But someone had embroidered it. In thread that must have been painstakingly saved and hidden, someone had stitched a single sentence in careful, deliberate letters: "I was here. My name is Eliza May." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face before she even realized she was crying. In 17 years of archaeology, she'd never cried on a dig. But this wasn't just an artifact, this was a voice. This was a human being reaching across nearly 200 years to say, "I existed, I mattered. Remember me?" "Dr. Chen?" Marcus's voice was gentle. "Are you okay?" She nodded, unable to speak. Around them, the rest of the team had gathered, drawn by some instinct that something profound had been uncovered. There were 8 of them in total, Archaeologists, historians, graduate students, and every single one of them stood in reverent silence, looking down at Eliza May's cache. Finally, Sarah found her voice. She buried this. She took everything that mattered to her, everything that proved she was a person and not property, and she hid it beneath the floor. Why? Dr. James Patterson, the team's historian, spoke up. He was 71, a man who had dedicated his entire life to uncovering the truth about slavery. Sometimes they did it to keep things safe from masters who would take an thing of value. Sometimes it was spiritual, objects buried for protection or to bring good fortune. Sometimes, his voice cracked, sometimes it was to leave proof that they existed, in case they were sold away, in case they didn't survive, in case everyone who knew their name died and they were forgotten. Sarah carefully photographed the cache from every angle before they began the painstaking process of removing each item for cataloging and preservation. As she worked, she couldn't stop thinking about Eliza May. Who was she? How old was she when she buried these treasures? What happened to her? The Riverside plantation records were extensive. The owners had been meticulous bookkeepers, but Sarah knew from experience that enslaved people were often listed only by first names, ages, and dollar values. Finding Eliza May in those records would be like finding a specific grain of sand on a beach. But that night, back in the small house the team had rented in the nearby town, Sarah sat up with the plantation ledgers while everyone else slept. She went through page after page of cramped handwriting, lists of human beings bought and sold like livestock. And then, at 2:30 in the morning, she found her, Eliza May, age 23, purchased from the estate of Colonel William Hardwick, December 1847. Price, $900. Skills, fine sewing, can read. Sarah's heart hammered. Eliza May could read. That was illegal for enslaved people in South Carolina. If her owners knew, she could be whipped. Or worse. But somehow she'd learned. And she'd used that forbidden knowledge to leave her message. The ledger entry continued. Daughter Ruth, age 4. Son Samuel, age 2. Eliza May had been a mother. Sarah turned the pages, looking for more mentions. She found them, but not the ones she wanted to find. January 1849. Ruth, age 6. Sold to the Richardson Plantation, Georgia. Price, $600. March 1849. Samuel, age 4. Sold to Mr. Thomas Beaufort. Destination unknown. Price, $550. The words blurred as Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Eliza May had lost both her children within 3 months. Sold away. That was why she'd buried her cache, not just to prove she existed, but to create a memorial to the children who had been ripped from her arms. The buttons weren't random. Looking at the detailed photographs on her laptop, Sarah could now see the pattern. Small buttons, the kind that would have fastened children's clothes. The cornhusk doll, a toy for a little girl. The marbles and the carved bird, toys for a little boy. The thimble with Eliza May's initials. The tool she used for the fine sewing that made her valuable enough to keep, even as her children were sold for profit. "Oh, Eliza," Sarah whispered into the darkness. "I see you. I hear you. I remember you." Over the next 8 months, Sarah's team excavated the remaining cabins at Riverside Plantation, then moved on to 11 other sites across South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. And what they found made international news. But not because of what it was, because they found the same thing. Every time, beneath the floors of slave cabins, in carefully concealed cavities, they found hidden caches. Not in every cabin, only in about 1 in 4. But when they found them, the contents were hauntingly similar. Buttons, small toys, scraps of fabric, carved objects, pieces of broken pottery mended with meticulous care, religious items, crosses made from twigs, stones arranged in patterns, cowrie shells that connected to West African spiritual traditions, and names, not always embroidered like Eliza May's, but scratched into metal, carved into wood, marked on pottery shards with whatever tool had been available. Names that plantation records had reduced to ledger entries, now speaking for themselves. I am Moses. I am a man. Josephine Baker, born 1831, mother of 7. This belonged to my son James. He was 6 years old. By November 2019, Sarah's team had uncovered 43 separate caches. The academic papers would come later. the museum exhibitions, the textbook revisions. But first, Sarah knew they needed to do something more immediate, more human. Working with genealogists and historians, they began trying to trace what had happened to the people whose names they'd found. It was painstaking work. Slavery had been designed to destroy families, to erase identities, to break the bonds between parents and children, husbands and wives. The paper trail was often cold or non-existent, but sometimes, miraculously, it wasn't. In February 2020, a genealogist named Patricia Okonkwo contacted the team. She'd been working for years on behalf of a client named Michael Thompson, a 68-year-old retired teacher from Atlanta who knew his ancestors had been enslaved but had hit dead ends in his research. "I think I found a connection," Patricia said over the phone, her voice vibrating with excitement. Michael's great-great-great-grandmother was named Ruth Thompson. She was born around 1843, enslaved on the Richardson plantation in Georgia. She lived to be 93 years old, and she told her children stories about being sold away from her mother when she was very young. She said her mother's name was Eliza, and that she'd lived on a plantation by a river in South Carolina. Sarah's hands went numb. "Can you send me everything you have?" The documents arrived within an hour. Birth records, death certificates, oral histories that Ruth's descendants had written down and preserved. And there, in a photograph from 1920, was Ruth Thompson herself, a tiny, fierce-looking woman with eyes that seemed to look straight through the camera and into Sarah's soul. Ruth had lived. She'd survived being sold at age 6. She'd grown up, married a man who took the surname Thompson after emancipation, had 11 children, and lived long enough to meet some of her great-grandchildren. She'd spent her freedom teaching other formerly enslaved people to read, running a small school from her kitchen table. And she'd never forgotten her mother. Sarah arranged a meeting with Michael Thompson. He drove to Columbia, South Carolina, and met her at the university lab where Eliza May's artifacts were being preserved and studied. Michael was a tall man with gentle eyes and his great-great-great-grandmother, Ruth's determined jaw. When Sarah led him to the table where Eliza May's cache was laid out, properly preserved now in archival conditions, he stopped breathing. "This was hers?" he whispered. "Yes. Your great-great-great-great-grandmother buried these beneath the cabin floor before your great-great-great-grandmother Ruth was sold. Look at this." Sarah pointed to the corn-husk doll. "We believe Eliza made this for Ruth. And these," she indicated 3 small buttons carved from bone, "these probably came from Ruth's dress. Eliza kept them after Ruth was taken from her." Michael reached out, then pulled his hand back. "Can I?" "Yes," Sarah said. "You can touch them. They're yours. They're your family's history." With infinite care, Michael picked up the corn-husk doll. His hands were shaking. "All my life," he said, "I've known my people were enslaved. I've known we survived. But it always felt so abstract, like it happened to people who weren't quite real. But this," he looked up at Sarah, tears streaming down his face. "She made this with her own hands, for her little girl, for Ruth. My grandmother, Ruth, great-great-great-grandmother, Sarah C." erected gently. "No," Michael said firmly. "She's my grandmother. All of them are. Time doesn't matter. Blood doesn't fade. She's my grandmother, and I'm her grandson, and she wanted me to know she existed. She wanted me to know she loved her baby girl even after they took her away." Over the next year, Sarah's team made 6 more connections between buried caches and living descendants. Each reunion was profound. Each one brought both grief for what had been lost and joy for what had survived. But it was the caches where they couldn't find descendants that haunted Sarah the most. The names carved in secret, the treasures buried with such care, the people who had been so thoroughly erased from official records that even the miracle of modern genealogy couldn't resurrect them. Until one night in March 2021, Sarah had an idea. Working with a filmmaker named Jordan Hayes, she created a digital archive, a website that documented every single cache they'd found. High-resolution photographs of every artifact, transcriptions of every carved and embroidered name, maps showing the locations of the plantations, the plantation records they'd uncovered. Everything. But more than that, she created a place where descendants could tell the rest of the story, where Michael Thompson could post the photograph of Ruth at age 93, smiling fiercely in front of her kitchen table school, where people could add what happened after, how their ancestors survived, resisted, built lives and family. IES and communities in freedom. They called the website We Were Here, the Buried Voices Project. It went live on April 15, 2021. Sarah expected maybe a few hundred visitors in the first week. They got 50,000 in the first day. Messages poured in from across the country, from across the world. Descendants of enslaved people searching for connections. Historians offering help with research. Genealogists volunteering their expertise. And most moving of all, messages from people who simply wanted to say, "Thank you for remembering them. Thank you for proving they mattered." One message came from a woman named Keisha Morrison in Detroit. "My grandmother used to tell me her grandmother told her stories about a woman named Eliza who could sew so beautifully she could make you cry, but who cried herself to sleep every night after her babies were sold. We never knew if it was true or just a story meant to help us remember. Now I know it was true. Now I know Eliza May was real. Now I know my grandmother's grandmother knew her, maybe even knew her children. We're connected. We're family. And because you found what she buried, I know exactly how much she loved us. All of us, all her descendants who she never got to meet. She buried proof that we mattered before we were even born." By the end of 2021, the Buried Voices Project had documented 78 separate caches across 14 states. More archaeologists joined the effort. More sites were excavated. More names emerged for beneath the ground. But Sarah kept coming back to that first cache, to Eliza May's careful embroidery, "I was here. My name is Eliza May." In December 2021, Sarah stood in front of an audience of 2,000 people at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. The museum had created a permanent exhibition featuring 12 of the caches, including Eliza May's. "What we found beneath those cabin floors," Sarah said, "wasn't just artifacts. It was evidence of the most fundamental human need, to be remembered, to matter, to leave proof that we existed and that our lives had meaning." Enslaved people were denied everything: their freedom, their families, their very names. They were listed in ledgers as property, reduced to dollar amounts and labor capacity. The system was designed to erase them completely, to make them forget who they were, and to ensure that history would forget them too. But they refused to be erased. With whatever materials they had, buttons, scraps of fabric, pieces of broken pottery, they created time capsules. They buried proof of their humanity beneath the very floors where they were forced to live as less than human. And they did it knowing they might never be found. They did it on faith that someday someone would dig deep enough to hear their voices. Every single cache we found contains the same message: I was here. I was a person. I loved. I suffered. I endured. Remember me. And now, thanks to their courage in burying these treasures, we can answer yes. We remember. We hear you. And we will make sure the world knows your names. The standing ovation lasted for 5 minutes. But the moment that meant the most to Sarah came afterward, when Michael Thompson approached her with a young girl holding his hand, his 9-year-old granddaughter, Eliza. "We named her after our grandmother," Michael said, "after Eliza May. And every year on her birthday we tell her the story. We tell her about the woman who buried proof of love beneath the floorboards. We tell her about Ruth, who survived being sold and lived to teach others to read. We tell her that she comes from people who refuse to be forgotten. People who turned buttons and thread and corn husks into immortality." Young Eliza looked up at Sarah with serious eyes. "Can I see the doll?" she asked. "The one my great-great-great-great-grandmother made?" Sarah led them to the exhibition. There, in a climate-controlled case under soft light, was Eliza May's cache. And there in the center was the corn-husk doll, 200 years old, worn but intact. "She made that for a little girl named Ruth," Sarah said. "Your great-great-great-grandmother. And Ruth kept it her whole life. And now it's here, telling the story of how much you were loved even before you were born." Young Eliza pressed her hand against the glass. "I won't forget," she whispered. "I promise I won't forget." Sarah felt tears stream down her face for the second time in her car. Because this was why they dug. Not for artifacts or academic papers or museum exhibitions, but for this. A 9-year-old girl making a promise to a woman who died 2 centuries before she was born. A promise that would be kept, generation after generation, because someone had taken buttons and thread and corn husks and transformed them into an unbreakable chain connecting past to present to future. That night, Sarah updated the Buried Voices Project website with a new section. It was titled, "The Same Thing Every Time," and it began with these words: "Beneath slave cabins across the American South, archaeologists have found the same thing every time, evidence that love is stronger than oppression, that the human need to be remembered cannot be destroyed, that mothers will find a way to hold their children close, even across centuries of separation, that people reduced to property will claim their humanity with whatever materials they have, and that no system of cruelty, no matter how thorough, can erase the truth that every single person matters. What we found beneath those cabin floors was proof that hope can be buried but never killed, that memory can be hidden but never destroyed, and that the act of saying 'I was here' echoes across time until someone hears it and answers, 'Yes, you were here, and because of you we are here, and we remember.'" By January 2026, the Buried Voices Project had grown beyond anything Sarah had imagined. There were now 247 documented caches. Thousands of descendants had made connections to their ancestors. The website received over 1 million visitors a year, and most importantly, history textbooks were being rewritten to include not just the facts of slavery, but the voices of the enslaved. People like Eliza May, who refused to be forgotten. Sarah still led digs, still uncovered caches, still felt her hands shake when she brushed away the soil to reveal another voice speaking across time. But now she knew that every time she found buttons and toys and carved names beneath the floor of a slave cabin, she wasn't just finding artifacts. She was answering a prayer that had been buried in the darkness for 200 years. She was saying, "Yes, I hear you, we all hear you, and we will never ever let the world forget your names." What Eliza May and thousands like her buried beneath those cabin floors was more than buttons and dolls and scraps of fabric. It was proof of an eternal truth, that no matter what systems of oppression try to erase us, the human spirit finds a way to say, "I was here, I mattered, remember me." And the miracle is that someone always does. Someone digs deep enough, someone listens hard enough, someone cares enough to brush away the soil and let those buried voices speak. We all leave traces of our existence, in the lives we touch, the love we give, the small acts of resistance we perform against forces that try to make us forget who we are. And somewhere, sometime, someone will find those traces and remember. Eliza May buried her treasures not knowing if anyone would ever find them, but she buried them anyway, on faith, on hope, on the stubborn insistence that her love for her children, her existence as a human being, would matter to someone someday. And she was right. 200 years later, her great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter stands in a museum, looking at a corn husk doll, and whispers, "I won't forget." That's the same thing they found every time beneath those cabin floors, proof that love and memory are stronger than any force that tries to destroy them. And proof that the most powerful act of resistance is simply this, to insist on being remembered.